You've heard of Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and Warren Buffett. You've seen the headlines, the rockets, the billions. But no one ever told you that 500 years ago, there was a man richer than any of them. His name was Jakob Fugger. Born in 1459 as the 10th child of a cloth merchant in the German city of Augsburg, Fugger had no title, no army, and no royal blood. But by the time he died, he had bankrolled popes, bought influence in the Catholic Church, and funded the rise of emperors. He controlled the flow of copper and silver across Europe and owned stakes in trade routes that reached as far as India and the Americas. His fortune was so large that it accounted for nearly 2% of Europe's total economy, something no billionaire today can match. And yet, his name has nearly been erased from public memory. Why do we know the stories of men who built online stores or social networks, but not the one who financed thrones? Why has history hidden the man who, for a time, quite literally owned Europe? Well, no more. This is the story of a man who once owned Europe. In the middle of 15th century Europe, power came from land, titles, and blood. Kings ruled by birthright. Popes ruled by divine claim. Most people lived under the authority of nobles or priests, working the land or serving in cities that were growing, but still dependent on old structures. It was a time of shifting order. In Italy, new money was rising in the form of bankers and traders. Venice, Florence, and Genoa were leading the change. Outside the Italian states, most of Europe still followed older ways, but cracks had started to form. And into this changing world, in the city of Augsburg, a boy named Jakob Fugger was born. Jakob came into the world in 1459, the 10th child of Jakob Fugger the Elder and his wife Barbara Basinger. The Fugger family was part of the merchant class, not nobility. They worked in trade, dealing in cloth and metals, and had become wealthy through careful business in the region. Jakob's grandfather, Hans Fugger, had moved to Augsburg nearly a century earlier. He married well, became a citizen, and built the family's first fortune by selling textiles to Italy. By the time Jakob was born, the Fugger name was known locally, and his father was one of the richest men in Augsburg. But even so, they were still merchants. Their name held weight in the market, not at court. They didn't own land or command armies. Their power came from coins, not crowns. Jakob was not raised for greatness. As a child, he was sent into the church. At age 12, he was entered into a minor religious order, likely with the expectation that he would take up a clerical life. That was common in large families. One son would carry on the family business, another would go into the church. But Jakob had other plans. At 14, records show that he was already in Venice, and he was not living as a monk. He was working and living at the Fondaco de' Tedici, the German merchant's lodge at the heart of Venetian trade. Venice was the centre of European commerce. Ships arrived daily from across the Mediterranean, carrying spices, silks, metals, and ideas. It was a city of contrasts and calculations. Jakob was still young, but he was learning from the best bankers, traders, and accountants and metal dealers. He learned how silver moved markets. He learned how loans shaped wars. He studied the double-entry bookkeeping system that allowed money to be tracked with precision. And he watched how decisions in back rooms could decide the future of entire kingdoms. Jakob stayed in Venice for over a decade. While his brothers handled other parts of the business, like founding branches in Nuremberg and trading with the papal court in Rome, Jakob focused on learning how to control not just trade, but the forces behind it. Venice gave him the tools he needed to reshape the family business into something far greater. It also gave him something else, a vision. The architectural and legal systems of Venice later inspired him when he built the Fuggieri, a complex of social housing for the poor in Augsburg. Even in his rise to power, he remembered the city that had shaped him. By the time Jakob returned to the German lands, he was ready to act. He expanded the family's reach into the mining regions of Salzburg. He began offering loans to independent silver mine owners who needed cash to continue their work. But Jakob didn't ask for simple repayment. He demanded koeks, a form of ownership, and he became a shareholder. That allowed him to control how and where the silver was sold. Slowly, mine by mine, Jakob pushed out the middlemen. Mine operators who had once sold to many were now selling only to the Fuggers. He set up new centres of operation across the region, in Augsburg, in Innsbruck, and in Halle. He built links between merchants, miners, and bankers. He met Archduke Sigismund of Tyrol, a Habsburg noble who controlled mining rights in the region. The Archduke spent recklessly and often needed quick money to pay debts and court expenses. Jakob stepped in. He offered the money in the form of carefully structured payments that made the Archduke dependent on him. In one case, Fugger paid 100,000 guilders in reparations on behalf of the Archduke directly to Venice. In another, he financed the court's wages, the craftsmen, and even covered Sigismund's personal debts. And through these deals, Jakob gained access to copper and silver mines. He formed a partnership with engineer Jan Thurzo in Banksa Bystrica, creating one of the largest copper companies in Europe. By 1517, Fugger money was funding more than half of Tyrol's public budget. In return, the family received exclusive rights to the silver and copper extracted from the region. Jakob Fugger was no longer just a merchant's son. He was becoming a force that shaped states. And this was only the beginning. In 1489, Jakob Fugger met a young ruler named Maximilian, who was already king of the German lands and would later become Holy Roman Emperor. They met at a trade fair in Frankfurt, and it was more than a handshake. That meeting marked the start of one of the most powerful business relationships in European history. Jakob Fugger, who had grown up as the son of a merchant, saw something in Maximilian. He believed the Habsburg family, which Maximilian belonged to, would soon rule over much of Europe, so Fugger decided to support him with money, connections, and trust. Maximilian needed that help. He had inherited huge problems from his uncle, Archduke Sigismund of Tyrol. Sigismund had borrowed a lot of money and mismanaged his lands. Jakob Fugger had already lent Sigismund large sums, paying off his debts and even covering the wages of workers in his court. In 1490, Sigismund lost control of his lands, and those lands passed into Maximilian's hands. When that happened, Maximilian promised to pay back everything Sigismund owned, and that promise tied him to Fugger. After that, the two became closely connected. Maximilian became emperor in 1493. He spent a lot of money on building power through marriage and diplomacy. He didn't fight wars to grow the Habsburg Empire. He used marriage to bring in new lands like Spain, Hungary, and Bohemia. These royal marriages were expensive, and Fugger helped pay for them. He funded the empire in ways no one else could. To thank him, Maximilian began selling parts of his land to Fugger. In 1507, he sold him the county of Würzburg and other nearby territories. In the following years, even more land was added. In total, Fugger became the ruler of over 50 towns and villages. But Fugger wasn't a nobleman, at least not yet. In 1511, Maximilian gave him a noble title. In 1514, he made him an imperial count. That meant Fugger could now deal with kings and nobles as one of their own. Fugger didn't rule by sword or crown, he ruled through money. Many people believed that he had power over Maximilian himself. Some even thought he controlled the empire from behind the scenes. While that idea might be an exaggeration, there is no doubt that Fugger had a huge influence. He gave the emperor the money he needed, and the emperor gave him business, land, and protection in return. During these same years, Fugger turned his business into a new kind of company. It became one of the first open trading firms in Europe, allowing for bigger deals and better control. While his brothers were still involved in the company, Jakob Fugger took charge of the most important decisions. He focused on mining silver and copper, which were the backbones of Europe's economy. He built mines in Tyrol and in Hungary, especially in the towns of Neusohl, which today is called Banksa Bystrica. With his business partner Hans Thurzo, he built furnaces, roads, and trade routes. The copper was sent to ports like Gdansk and Lübeck, then shipped to Russia, Venice, and even India. Some was sold through Lisbon, some through Vienna and Trieste. At one point, Fugger controlled most of the copper production in Europe. That made him one of the most powerful men in the world. And if you still don't understand how powerful he truly was, you're about to meet one of his most important clients. At one point in history, the most powerful client Jakob Fugger ever had was not a king or an emperor, It was the Pope. Yes, you heard that right. The head of the Catholic Church, the most sacred figure in Europe, once owed money to a banker from Augsburg. In the year 1500, Fugger began lending vast sums of money to the Roman Curia. The money was used for grand projects, including the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica and the decoration of the Sistine Chapel. These were not small repairs, they were enormous constructions, meant to show the glory of the church, but that glory had a price. The Vatican did not have enough gold to pay for it, so they turned to Fugger. To repay him, the church began to raise money through taxes and the sale of indulgences. Indulgences were documents people bought to reduce their punishment for sins. This practice became more aggressive. In German territories, people were told to donate coins for the forgiveness of sins, a message that many priests, monks, and thinkers found deeply offensive. One of them was a young monk named Martin Luther. Luther believed the church had become greedy. He saw money flowing into Rome while ordinary people struggled. In 1517, he wrote his famous 95 Theses, a list of criticisms aimed at church corruption. Many of these complaints were about indulgences and the selling of grace. Indulgences existed before Fugger's loans, but now they were everywhere, and many of them were funding repayments to Fugger. This moment helped spark the Protestant Reformation, a major religious shift that would change Europe forever. And it was tied, at least in part, to a banker who had become too important to ignore. Fugger's influence in Rome did not stop at loans. In 1505 and 1506, he financed the creation of the Swiss Guard, the soldiers who still protect the Pope today. His business had been moving money for the church since the 1470s, helping transfer church revenue from faraway places like Sweden all the way to Rome. Later, Fugger took control of the papal mint in Rome, called the Zecca. Between 1508 and 1524, his company minted coins for 4 different popes. He made 66 types of coins during that time, each stamped with religious authority and produced by the hands of a banker. But being this powerful came with danger. In 1509, one of Fugger's biggest investors, Cardinal Melchior de Macau, died in Rome. He had secretly placed 150,000 guilders into Fugger's business in exchange for interest, which was a clear violation of church laws at the time. When this was discovered, there was panic. The Pope, the Church of Brixen, and the Cardinal's family all demanded the money. Fugger could not repay it all at once. He faced financial ruin. Emperor Maximilian stepped in. To protect his banker, the emperor agreed to fight for Pope Julius II in a war against Venice. In return, the Pope recognized Maximilian as the heir to the Cardinal's fortunes. The debts were settled by cancelling what the Church owed Fugger. Fugger also gave valuable jewels to the Pope as part of the deal. In exchange, Maximilian demanded even more loans. Fugger agreed. He had saved himself, but the price was continued support for the Emperor's wars. By 1510, Fugger was running the entire company alone. His brothers had died and now the business carried his name. Jakob Fugger and Brothers' Sons. Over the next decade, he multiplied the family fortune many times over. By 1511, he was worth 200,000 guilders. By the time of his death, he had more than 2 million. That was a fortune equal to around 2% of all the money in Europe. But after Maximilian's death in 1519, the throne of the Holy Roman Empire was once up again for election. 4 candidates stepped forward: Charles of Habsburg, King Francis of France, King Henry of England, and the Elector of Saxony. Charles, the grandson of Maximilian, was young, but had powerful claims. Still, he needed the votes of 7 prince-electors to win the crown. Francis of France was ready to spend 300,000 guilders to buy those votes. Charles had little cash of his own, so once again he turned to Jakob Fugger. Fugger raised over 850,000 guilders for Charles's campaign, more than double what Francis offered. Of that total, 550,000 came directly from Fugger. The rest came from other rich merchant families and bankers. With this money, Charles won every vote. On July 28, 1519, he was elected Holy Roman Empire. Later, the Pope confirmed his title, and in 1530, Charles became the last emperor to be crowned by a pope. Fugger now had a direct line to the most powerful man in the world. Charles V ruled over Spain, Germany, the Netherlands, Austria, and much of the New World, and he owed it all to Fugger. In 1521, Charles owed Fugger over 600,000 guilders. He paid most of it back by handing over control of silver and copper mines in Tyrol. In 1523, at the Imperial Diet in Nuremberg, leaders wanted to limit the power of big businesses like Fugger, but Fugger reminded Charles who had paid for his crown. He told the court clearly, and without fear, that Charles could not have become emperor without him. The laws were never passed. Fugger kept his monopoly, and he received new rights to mine quicksilver and cinnabar in Spain. His company stayed in the Spanish mining business until 1645. Jakob Fugger shaped the politics of Europe with gold. He funded wars, decided elections, and even influenced the church. Kings depended on him, popes worked with him, and he used his power to write rules that protected his fortune. He was not a ruler, but through coins, contracts, and quiet deals, he built a kingdom of his own, and that was only part of what he built. Besides the famous Fuggieri, Jakob Fugger built much more. Jakob Fugger used his money to secure land, to influence rulers, and to buy political protection. But he also used it to leave something permanent behind. Starting in 1509, he began building a chapel in the church of St. Anna in Augsburg. The chapel became the burial place for himself, his brothers Ulrich and Georg, and later 2 of his nephews. He hired some of the best German artists of the time, names like Albrecht Dürer, Hans Burgmeier, and Georg Brau the Elder. The design was influenced by Renaissance buildings, especially those from Venice and Rome. The Fugger Chapel became Germany's first building in the Renaissance style. Jakob Fugger wanted to be remembered not only as a rich man, but as a nobleman with taste, culture, and power. The chapel was finished in 1512, just a few years before he received his noble title from Emperor Maximilian. It helped set him apart from the local patricians. Through its beauty and decoration, it declared the Fugger name would not disappear. In 1518, the chapel was consecrated to the Holy Virgin Mary, the Evangelist Matthew, and the Ultra Sacrament of Jesus Christ. Over time, the rest of St. Anne's Church became Protestant, but the Fugger Chapel remained Catholic. This strange situation still exists today, a Catholic chapel inside a Protestant church, preserved by the Fugger Foundation. It is a rare and powerful example of how private wealth shapes sacred spaces in Germany. While the chapel honoured the dead, Jakob Fugger also built for the living. Between 1512 and 1515, he constructed the Fuggerhause, a large and elegant residence in Augsburg. It was built near the wine market, a key area in the city. The Damenhof, or ladies' courtyard, was modelled on the great courtyards of Florence. It was the first secular Renaissance building in Germany. The Fuggerhause became both his private home and the centre of his operations. He received powerful guests there, including emperors and nobles. The building was expanded again in 1523, showing that Fugger's ambition was still growing. Later generations of the Fugger family continued to enlarge the complex. During World War II, the buildings were damaged in air raids, but parts of them survived and were rebuilt. Some rooms remain in their original form. The Fugger family still owns the property today, and parts of it house the Fürst Fugger Privatbank. Jakob Fugger's influence also reached the Church of St. Moritz in Augsburg. In 1515, he pushed for better sermons in his parish. 2 years later, Pope Leo X granted him the right to choose the church's priests. The Fugger family still holds that right. The foundation he created for this purpose still exists, making it one of the longest-lasting church partnerships in Europe. His project stretched beyond Germany. He paid for the reconstruction of the Church of Santa Maria dell'Anmina in Rome. In Spain, he funded the Church of San Blas in Almagro. He built a chapel in Oberkirchberg and constructed a palace in Weissenhorn. Each of these buildings carried his name or his coat of arms. Each one was a signal of power, legacy, and wealth. Jakob Fugger built symbols. Every church, palace, and stone marked the rise of a man who had no royal blood, but more power than many kings. He used art, architecture, and religion to tell the story of a new kind of ruler, one made of coin, not crown. You've now seen how Jakob Fugger built an empire with money. You've seen how he bought land, financed popes, and shaped cities, but you must be wondering, what happened to all of that fortune, and what became of the Fugger Empire after his death? When Jakob Fugger died on December 30, 1525, the world lost a man who had shaped kings, bought emperors, and financed the church itself. According to the official inventory taken after his death, his estate included 3 million guilders in total assets and almost 868,000 guilders in debts. That left a final surplus of 2,132,261 guilders. That fortune was passed on to his nephews, who inherited not just money, but an empire built on banking, mining, and political influence. To understand how vast that fortune was, historians estimate that Jakob Fugger controlled close to 2% of Europe's total GDP at the time. If we apply that same percentage to today's European economy, his net worth would be equal to over $400 billion in modern terms, placing him above today's wealthiest individuals like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos. In pure economic power, Fugger was one of the richest men who ever lived. But because Jakob had no children of his own, his business passed to Anton Fugger, Raymond Fugger, and their cousin Hieronymus. Anton soon became the head of the firm. He followed the path his uncle had set, expanding trade routes into Buenos Aires, Mexico, and the West Indies. He also stayed close to power, supporting Emperor Charles V and later Emperor Ferdinand I. Anton doubled the family's fortune by 1546. People called him the Prince of Merchants, a title that reflected how powerful the Fugger family still was during his leadership. Anton also planned for the future. He arranged marriages between his children and noble families, ensuring that the Fugger name would be tied to Europe's elite. This gave the family respect and protection, even when their direct influence began to fade. Over the centuries, the Fugger family stepped away from large-scale international trade and mining. Their connection to emperors and popes grew weaker. The company survived, but it no longer played the central role it once had. Today, the Fugger family still exists. They still own part of their old properties and run a bank in Augsburg, the first Fugger Privat Bank. But the power that once moved kings and reshaped nations is now just a memory. You might now be asking yourself, why do so few people know this story? Why is Jakob Fugger a man who funded wars, shaped the Reformation, and built empires missing from most history books? There are several reasons. Fugger was never a king or a general. He wore no crown and fought no battles. He was a banker, a merchant, and a negotiator. Protestants hated him for supporting the Pope. Catholics turned away when he became more powerful than the Church itself. His name became a symbol of greed. Some called him the Antichrist. In time, his story was pushed aside, erased, or simply ignored. But maybe that's exactly the point. Jakob Fugger's life reminds us that power often hides behind gold doors and sealed letters. Many of the most powerful people in history worked silently from the shadows, while kings and popes stood in the spotlight. And perhaps, even today, the true rulers of the world are not the ones giving speeches, but the ones writing the checks.